Hi guys! Today we're going to look at how to make the enemies randomly drop health collectibles when they're killed. When the player walks over the collectible, a portion of their health is then restored. Okay, we'll start with this scene that continuously spawns enemies that wander around and chase the player. The player can also fire bullets and kill the enemies. We created this in our 2D top-down shooter series, so take a look if you want to know how it was done. Alternatively, you can download this project by supporting us on Patreon. All the links you need can be found in the description. Okay, the first thing we'll do is install an asset from the Asset Store to use for the health collectible. We'll go to assetstore.unity.com. Then we'll search for 2D Sci-Fi Weapons Pack. We'll select this one. Then we'll add it to our assets and open it in Unity. The package manager should open at the right package. If it doesn't, select My Assets at the top and find the package in the list. Once we've found the package, we'll download and install it. Next, we'll create a game object for the health collectible. We'll close the package manager and click the plus button on the hierarchy. We'll create an empty game object. We'll call this Collectable. For the player to pick up a collectible, we need to be able to detect collisions. To allow us to do this, we'll click the Add Component button and add a Box Collider 2D. We'll tick this box to make this collider a trigger. This means that it will detect collisions, but it won't block the movement of the player or enemies. Next, we need to add a visual representation for the collectible. We'll right-click the collectible in the hierarchy and add a child game object. We'll call this Graphics. Then we'll click the Add Component button and add a sprite renderer. We want the collectibles to be displayed above the ground but below the player and enemies. We can do this using sorting layers. We already set up our sorting layers in an earlier video in this series and added a layer for collectibles. Let's set the sorting layer for the collectible to this now. Everything we've done so far on this object will be relevant to all collectibles, not just the health collectible. So what we'll do is use this to create a base prefab. Then we can create variants of this for specific collectibles, such as the health collectible. Let's open the prefabs folder in the project panel. Then we'll drag the collectible into the folder to create the prefab. We can now delete the collectible from the hierarchy. Then we'll right-click on the prefab and select Create Prefab Variant. We'll call this Health Collectible. Let's double-click this to open the prefab editor. We'll switch to the scene view. We can see that this has created a new prefab that inherits all the components and settings from the base collectible. We can then override these settings as needed. First of all, we'll set the sprite. We'll navigate to the sprites folder of the asset we imported. We'll open the blue folder and select Med Blue. This sprite is a bit large, so we'll change the pixels per unit to 800. Then we'll click the Apply button. We'll select the graphics object in the hierarchy and drag the sprite into the sprite field. The next thing we need to do is edit the collider to fit with the sprite. We'll select the parent object in the hierarchy. Then we'll click the Edit button on the collider. Now we can click and drag to resize the collider until it roughly covers the sprite. The next thing we need to do is add some scripts. We'll click back to close the prefab editor. Then we'll navigate to the Game Scripts folder in the project panel. We'll click the plus button and create a new folder. We'll call this Collectables. Then we'll open this folder and add a new script. We'll call this Collectable. This script is going to be needed for all collectibles, so we'll add it to the Collectable base prefab. We'll find the prefab and double-click to open it. We'll click Add Component and add the Collectable script. Then we'll double-click the script to open it in the editor. First of all, we'll remove the default methods. Then we'll add the onTriggerEnter2D method. This will be called when another collider enters the collider of the collectible. We need to check if the other collider is the player. We'll do this by trying to get the player movement component from the other collider. We can then check if this is not null. If it's not, then we know that the player has collided with the collectible. The next thing to do is have the player pick up the collectible. For now, we'll just destroy the collectible by calling destroy, passing in the game object. OK, let's save this and switch back to Unity. We'll click back to exit the prefab editor. Then we'll go to the prefabs folder and drag a health collectible into the scene. Let's press play to try it out. Now the player picks up the health as it walks over it. The next thing to do is make it actually add some health. For this, we're going to need some more scripts. Let's stop the game and navigate back to the Collectible Scripts folder in the project panel. Different collectibles in the game will have different behaviours. So what we'll do is create a C# interface that these behaviours will implement. We'll click the plus button and add a new script. We'll call this iCollectable Behaviour. Then we'll double-click to open it in the editor. We'll delete the default methods. Then we'll change this from a class to an interface. This isn't a mono behaviour, so we'll remove this as well. Then we'll add a method called onCollected. This will take the game object of the player as a parameter. A C# interface is essentially a contract that can be applied to other classes. So any class that implements this interface must implement this method. In this video, we'll create a behaviour that implements the interface and adds health. In the future, we'll create more behaviours for invincibility and weapons. All of them will implement the same interface though, so we can call this method when the player picks up the collectible, regardless of what the implementation is. OK, let's save this and switch back to Unity to create the health collectible behaviour. We'll click the plus button and add a new script. We'll call this health collectible behaviour. Then we'll go to the prefabs folder. We'll double-click the health collectible prefab to open the editor. We'll click the Add Component button and add the health collectible behaviour. Then we'll double-click the script to open it in the editor. We'll delete the default methods. Then we'll specify that we want the class to implement the interface. Now we need to implement the onCollected method. We want to add some health, so we'll add a private serializable float field for the amount of health to add. Then, in the method, we'll get the health controller component of the player. We can then call the Add Health method, passing in the amount of health to add. OK, that's it for this script. The next thing to do is switch to the Collectable script to make use of this. We'll add a private field for the behaviour interface. Then we'll add the awake method. We'll assign the field by calling getComponent to get the component that implements this interface. Now, in the onTriggerEnter2D method, we can call onCollected on the behaviour. We'll pass in the game object of the player. Because we're using the interface, this could be any behaviour. In this case, it will be the health collectible behaviour, so it will call the onCollected method we just implemented to add some health. OK, let's save all the scripts and switch back to Unity. We'll set the amount of health to add to 10. Let's press play to try this out. First of all, we'll take some damage. Now, when we pick up the collectible, the health bar goes back up. The next thing to do is get the enemies to drop collectibles when they die. Let's stop the game. We'll close the Prefab editor and delete the health collectible from the hierarchy. Then we'll click the plus button and add an empty game object. We'll call this Collectable Spawner. This object will be responsible for spawning all collectibles. We'll click the plus button on the project panel and create a new script to handle the spawning. We'll call this Collectable Spawner. We'll drag this onto the object to assign it. Then we'll double-click the script to open it. We'll remove the default methods. Then we'll create a private list of game objects for all the collectibles that can be spawned. This will just contain the health collectible for now, but in future it will have different collectibles that will spawn at random. We'll make this serializable so we can assign it from the inspector. Then we'll create a public method to spawn a collectible. This will take in a vector2 parameter for the position the collectible should be spawned. In here we'll randomly select a collectible to spawn. To do this, we'll use the random range method to get a random index for the list. We'll pass in 0 as the minimum value and the number of items in the list as the maximum value. This will give us a random number between 0 and the maximum number of collectibles we have. We'll use this as the index to get a collectible from the list. Then we'll call the instantiate method to create the selected collectible. We'll pass in the specified position. For the rotation, we'll use quaternion identity to specify no rotation. OK, that's it for this script. Let's save it and switch back to Unity. We'll select the collectible spawner in the hierarchy. Then we'll navigate to the Prefabs folder in the project panel. We'll drag the health collectible prefab into the list of collectibles. Now we have a way to spawn collectibles. The next thing we need to do is add a script to randomly do this when an enemy dies. Let's double-click the enemy prefab to open the prefab editor. Then we'll navigate to the enemy scripts folder and add a new script. We'll call this enemy collectible drop. We'll drag the script onto the enemy to assign it. Then we'll double-click the script to open it. We'll delete the default methods. Then we'll add a serializable float field for the chance of a collectible drop. This will be a percentage value from 0 to 1. The higher this value, the more chance the enemy being killed will trigger a collectible drop. We'll also need a reference to the collectible spawner, so we'll add a field for this. Then we'll add the awake method. We'll find the collectible spawner and assign it to the field. Next, we'll add a public method called randomly drop collectible. In here, we need to work out whether a collectible should be dropped or not. To do this, we'll use random range to create a random float between 0 and 1. It's important to add the F character to ensure we generate a random float number rather than an integer. Next, we'll check if the chance to drop value is greater than this random number. So the higher the chance value is, the more likely it will be greater than the random value. If it is greater, then we'll call the spawn collectible method on the collectible spawner. We'll pass in the position of the enemy as the position to spawn. OK, let's save this and switch back to Unity. We'll select the enemy in the hierarchy. Then we'll set the chance of collectible drop to 0.3. The final thing to do is wire this up to the onDied event. We'll click the plus button to add a new subscriber. Then we'll drag the enemy into the object slot. From the drop-down, we can then select Enemy Collectible Drop, Randomly Drop Collectible. So now, when the enemy dies, it will call this method to randomly decide whether to drop a collectible or not. If it does drop a collectible, the collectible spawner will then randomly pick one of the available collectibles to drop. We'll click back to exit the Prefab editor. Let's press play to try it out. First of all, we'll take some damage. Then we'll shoot some enemies. Every now and then an enemy will drop a health collectible. We can then pick this up to restore some health. In the next video in this series, we'll look at how to make the player's sprite flash when they're invincible. If you want to be alerted when this one's out, then subscribe and click the bell icon. If you have any questions or feedback on this video, let us know in the comments. A big thank you to all our patrons, we really appreciate you helping to support the channel. If you'd like to help and also get access to the source code, you can find details in the description. Thanks guys!